Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another exciting edition of the Blunt News and our smoke break. So bear with me because I'm still trying to find an assistant. I have a special guest with me today. My special guest wrote a very, very good book. But I'm going to let you guys be the judge of that. We all know that I don't really bring anything forward unless I think there's value in it. And I think there's a lot of value in this. And I've been a friend of this gentleman on LinkedIn. I share some of his beliefs. I like what he's doing. And I think this is a good book to share. Hang on, I'm just typing it out. And then we'll bring this gentleman on who has been extremely patient with me because I have screwed up some of his timing. But it's all good. He is here with us. I want you to welcome my friend, Brian Sekandi.
Hey, Brian.
How you doing, Mr. Brian?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Fantastic, man. Good to have. Good. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
No, thank you, and thank you for being so patient, so kind. Like I said before, I use the kid excuse sometimes, but yeah, sometimes it's really the kids, man.
Absolutely no worries. Considering I wrote the book "Kids of Cannabis," you absolutely have nothing to be worried about.
Yes, and sir, can I tell you that when I got it, the green screen is going to blank out.
Yeah, maybe I got a copy here. I'll my copy.
Very cool. Yeah, and I got to tell you, man, my 10-year-old who is he's going to be 11 in a week.
Nice.
Wow. So he read it, and I asked him. I said, "Give me your honest opinion. Is this a good book for kids?" And his response to me was, "Dad, this really, like, I can't see any kid." And he's real technical, so he's like, "I can't see any kid between 8 and like 15 not liking this book."
Oh, that's such a nice.
And I went, "Wow, that's a good range."
Yeah.
I'm like, why 8? And this was his response to me. So his little brother, my middle child is 6 and he's going to be 7.
Gotcha.
So he says, "Well, Gideon is 6 and he's not really ready for a book like that. He may not really understand it, and he's still really learning his words. So I don't think that that's a book for, a 5 or a 6-year-old."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Oh, that makes sense."
Mm-hmm.
Because I read it and I was fine with it, but I didn't think of it from a kid perspective.
Of course.
And I think that's, it's my opinion. I think the adults are going to buy the book.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the kid is your target market.
Yes. Well, we have kind of two target markets. Clearly, it's the parents that are buying the books for their kids. And because, the book is Kids of Cannabis, my mom and dad work in cannabis, this is our story. It's definitely the type of book that, parents going to want to make sure they sanction for their kid before their kid's read.
Mm-hmm. They're going to
absolutely. But as we put it together, we were writing it and we said, how do we create a book that is compelling enough for that, 9+-year-old, but also for a parent or a grandparent that they would feel like they're getting something useful out of it. And so at the back, you have that glossary term, which is a bit more elevated in terms of vocabulary and language, but definitely something that I think, parents and adults would be able to get a better understanding of some of the things that we cover in the book.
Right. Now, one of the things, I had some pages marked here. Hang on. I love this part. The pages aren't numbered, but it's the page here where he says, "My pop travels from work to conferences, and he loves travel and hospitality," and the stickers.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, that's my kids. just whatever would be kid or like stickers, little toys,
Yeah.
little things. And I went, oh my God. Now I'm a big firm believer in early education.
Yes.
One of the things that I do talk about on this platform, as you know, I don't hold you to. I'm not going to ask you if you've watched every show, but one I talk about mental health and I talk about education.
Yeah.
Now we've all seen what's happening in our country over the past several years, especially with Trump's presidency, and now that Biden is in, and all the after effects of everything that's happening, and now this so-called freeing of the cannabis industry, where now it's free and anyone can talk about it and anyone can do it out in the open, and it's a different world we're living in. How early do you think cannabis education should be available to children? At what age do you teach them this is not bad, but as a kid, you need to stay away from it? Because again, we don't have research on what cannabis can do to kids.
Yes.
It's a very touchy subject.
It's a very touchy subject, and it's an interesting question, and I think the answer depends, right? And I think for a lot of people, it's an easy, they should all be told, do not use, do not smoke, and and that's the education till 18. Well, that's not actually accurate, and that's not the reality. And so one of the things that we have to, I think, it's important to talk about in the conversation with cannabis and kids is there's a lot of kids that have to use cannabis for medical purposes. And those kids that are using cannabis for medical purposes are also dealing with the stigma that their medicine has this negative connotation to it. So you can imagine if you live in a state where, only someone who's licensed can administer cannabis, even during, the school day, that makes it very difficult for a family if they're trying to make sure that their child is being taken care of. And so, that child who's, needing to take cannabis for medical reasons, or that family that has, children that are using cannabis for medical reasons, they need to be educated about cannabis very early. And they need to be educated on not just the recreational aspect of cannabis, but all aspects of cannabis. And so that education is important. Now, in terms of, let's say, most majority of folks who aren't necessarily dealing with a medical condition and using cannabis for that purpose, it's important to educate your children as early as you can, in terms of that age of curiosity, which is typically probably like 8 and above. And if you have somebody at home that consumes cannabis, and you might increase that education early. But you want to educate your kids at home. And I've been saying this, for the last couple of months, is that if you don't educate your kids, somebody else will. And they likely won't have the best interest of your kids at heart. They might be thinking about either commercial interest, self-interest. And so if education starts at home, what you're ensuring is that when your kids become of age, that they're informed adults. They're making decisions not because of fear, but they're making decisions because they're informed. And so one of the great things that we talk about in the book is around education. And that's the place where I think everybody needs to start in the cannabis industry. But as we talk about education, a lot of people don't understand, and this is where I think we focus with the kids, is that cannabis historically has been used to, the first piece of paper was made out of hemp. You could be used for biofuel. It could be used to make a home construction, be used for food and medicine that we're seeing today, textiles, plastic. It touches so much of our daily life, from agriculture all the way to what we're seeing in healthcare, that there's so much you can expose a child to before you get into consumption, smoking, and vaping, and do not use. And I think, let's get kids curious about horticulture and botany and chemistry and science and all the wonderful things that cannabis is helping us expose, the world to, climate change, for example, and environmental issues. And we can save the other conversation about consumption, to a bit later in terms of that education profile.
Right. No, I am so overwhelmingly passionately excited about the educational aspects of this for us as a society. As if we're the cannabis community,
Yeah.
We have to make sure, I don't know if you've noticed, but I have a ton of cannabis industry friends and all different sectors, tech, lighting, the horticultural, everybody. And we all seem to have the same mindset that we have to kind of hold ourselves to a certain standard.
Yes.
That has to become now a universal standard. So everybody has the same knowledge, the same information, and then it's a difference of quality, quality control, quality management. Once that's sifted through all the rhetoric that has been through our educational system, now we can easily move forward and say, well, here, we can use hemp in construction material. We can use hemp in, medications. We can use hemp in alternative fuels. We can do just like you said. And it creates a vast new economy that everybody in this country, in the world, can actually get behind, and it only helps improve. Now, where do you think that education takes us when my 10-year-old read this? Where in 10 years from now, while he's in college, where do you think the cannabis education that this has become, cannabis revolution, where do you think that, 10 years from now, what does that kid have, your target market?
That's a great question. I think what's going to happen is a couple of things. I think one, by exposing children very early on to not just just things of life that are important for them to know, right? It's just going to create this informed, young adults that will be able to participate in innovating and improving the world. And so we give you just an example how cannabis factors into that. Because cannabis is coming from the age of prohibition, there's a lot of focus in trying to understand what is the cannabis plant. And if you think about that, when is the last time has a family or a society have we been so obsessed about a plant and understanding the plant? And this plant is not just a plant that you can use as a commodity, it's raw form, but you can also refine it and create products. And so now folks are really paying a lot of attention to what's in their product, how does it work, what's being used. And you see this in the medical channels in cannabis, that if a medical cannabis is being prescribed, parents are asking a lot more questions about that cannabis than they are asking about, your regular pharma. So I think this is kind of, in many ways, cannabis is opening the door to this idea that plants, which have been, the foundation of all civilization, are so important to us for food, medicine, and just survival, that I think it's going to create this rebirth of not just looking at cannabis, but looking at all the plants within this, huge diversity and understanding cannabinoids and terpenes and all of these little things that just make us feel good. And so I think the children and young adults and the young generation being exposed to this very early is just going to create a level of innovation, because all of a sudden they can go back to nature, something so basic as a plant, and find with the fact that we live in the most, advanced time of our, civil, as modern history has recorded. So, I think that's kind of quite interesting, and kind of where I see it going.
So I got to ask you the general question here, because everybody's going to want to know. So this past year, we've all experienced, the pandemic blues. We've seen the cannabis community blow up and be called essential. We've seen the, how important it's kind of woven into our infrastructure as a society, that so many people finally came out and said, yeah, I'm a cannabis person too. So now we have a lot more faces out in the public, which is good, considering all the people who put their faces out there in the past. My question is, how soon do you think these big pharma companies are going to try to push back? because it negates everything that they've said for the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
How much of a, let me rephrase the question. How much of a factor do you think these big pharmaceutical companies that still have, hundreds of millions in investment towards these dangerous drugs and chemicals, how much do you think they're going to fight to hold on to that share?
It's a good question. I think, there's probably a two-pronged strategy, which is how do we ensure we don't lose as much, existing market share for new markets? And then it's the other side is how do we develop, unique IP where we can piggyback off of the trend. So the one thing is consumers are driving this initiative. People, regular people, I shouldn't even say consumers, citizens, right? They're the ones saying, enough is enough. We need to change cannabis regulations. They're seeing this as a human rights issue, as a healthcare issue, as an environmental issue. And I think that pressure is going to be hard for any institution, any government, any industry to try to prevent, because you're really going against, the tides of history. That being said, I do think that, if there's one area of potential concern is around cannabis's, the testings and some of the development is really being, it's becoming a lifesaver in terms of treating folks as an alternative to opioids. And that could be a complete lifesaver for communities, but also a lifeline in terms of there's an alternative, right? There's an alternative where the side effects or the risk factor profiles is less than what some of the medication is. So I think there's in terms of fighting, I think that there's probably a bit of like worry and pushback, but I think over time, I think you're going to see the pharmaceutical industry embrace the cannabis industry, and in many ways, they'll probably become a healthy part of the industry long term.
Now, here's the ethical question. Now, I have, not saying I'm an expert, but I have seen, especially in these last few years, the arguments that, you can play devil's advocate on either side. So here's the ethical question. Should big pharmaceutical companies actually be allowed to step into the big cannabis, corporate cannabis, realm and still use their methods of functionality, which is clearly not in the patient's, the people's best interest? Should we allow that to even happen?
So there's a couple of things, right? So from the pharmaceutical industry, what value the pharmaceutical industry has to the cannabis industry is its infrastructure, its distribution, and its ability to take a product through clinical trials into a level of FDA approval. Now that experience, that know-how, you can't find anywhere else, and it's best in class. And in many ways, there is a role for many of these, pharmaceutical executives and talent in the cannabis industry. I'm less concerned about the pharmaceutical industry getting the cannabis industry. What I would say, though, is the cannabis industry and those who have been part of the cannabis industry have always been held account for what they do and what their product might do. And the one thing, though, I think that, society needs to take a look at in terms of all industries, but pharmaceutical in particular, is have they been held accountable for the things that they have done? And so, I know this is about cannabis, but if you think about most illicit street drugs were once pharmaceutical RX drugs, right? Most of them. And so the idea of the next crisis, drug crisis in our streets will likely develop in a lab, and will develop in a lab with people that know better, that have the ability to create something that might help a small group, but can create a huge amount of damage to others. So, in terms of, I would love to see the pharmaceutical industry, lean back onto, things like cannabis and plants, which are better and have a better risk profile. And with their experience and their know-how, they could absolutely, be game changers, especially when we talk about medical usage of cannabis. Now, at the same time, I think some pharmaceutical companies need to be held accountable for their impact to society, because cannabis, those who've been involved in cannabis have been held accountable for decades.
For everything.
In decades. And I think that when we look at this war against drug, we now need this war against drugs to challenge and say, well,
prescription drugs.
100%. What is the problems that we're dealing with today?
Right.
Those big problems are prescription drugs.
Right. See, one of the things, I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things I talk about and I work with people behind the scenes is these, like for example, the charity Last Prisoner Project, and lots of other similar charities to that, or foundations or causes. I always try to spread that word. Like, I know people who, their whole lives were taken away because they had an ounce of weed on them, or a couple of ounces of weed. We all know that's not very much. That's not a lot. That's not big. This is not life-threatening or Pablo Escobar kind of money. These people were taken down for hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars worth of what they called illegal drugs, which now everybody is saying, grow it at home, do it on your porch, do it on your balcony, and people are doing this, and it's good to see. But I guess if we're teaching this to the kids, and I'm a firm believer in that, I think we should teach them the negative history that was there too, like all the people who were harmed by it, the families who were torn apart, the people who are still rotting in jail. And with all due respect, I see that you're a black guy, I'm a white guy. There really is a difference in how it's perceived from somebody who's black and somebody who's white, and how it's stereotyped around the world, especially in the United States. I grew up in Brooklyn. I have friends of all different colors, shapes, and sizes, and I saw the difference in how things were treated and how people were treated. Do you think that cannabis has the long-term effect to erase a lot of the racial inequalities that it actually helped create?
Well, this is the opportunity that I think we've been given, right? Is by righting this wrong, by reversing this ban, this global prohibition event against cannabis, we're immediately fixing some racial disparities that have existed because of criminalization, whether we like it or not. And so, a lot of people say this cannabis is not a race issue, and in many ways, it really is, right? It's an issue in terms of the sense that we have to recognize that the start of criminalization was really driven around, xenophobia, racism, and this separation of one culture to another.
Hang on, give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Let me interrupt you right there. We can get back. So in digging around in some research, I actually had this conversation with somebody the other day. A little bit of information I found out.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get 100% of the timeline down, but basically in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a big fight between a timber giant in the United States and one of the hemp giants, one of the growing hemp giants, because hemp was still processed in the 1800s. And a timber giant who was buying up all this land and cutting down all the trees and processing the timber, all the wood, started making political contributions to these senators and governors and local politicians and helping. So he had them all in his pocket as he continued to build the timber and the locomotive industry all across America. So I don't know if that's necessarily the start of this, buying. I mean, look, people have been buying politicians for forever, but this may have been the money maker. People say, well, hey, if you put some money in a politician's pocket, you can get your competitor thrown in jail.
Yes, I mean, listen, and there probably was some business interest aligned, but in that period of time, there was a lot of persecution against jazz musician and jazz culture, and and cannabis was or reefer was was very much part of jazz culture. And there was, again, even back then, immigration around coming from, south of the border. And so, there was a lot of, because if you think about it, prior to that, cannabis was widely used and there wasn't any issue, right?
In doctors' offices, in pharmaceutical the drugstore had cannabis oil.
The American Medical Association said that do not ban this. And so in many ways it didn't. So, it might sound very divisive to say start off as a race issue. Folks wanted to make it they made
it a race issue.
A race issue, but there was a lot of folks on both sides, in sense white and black, who were looking at this and saying this was wrong. This is a bad idea. This was not going to be good. Over time, as we started to enforce these laws, the impact was clearly driven on racial lines, right? But again, I think the origins, one can argue. But again, the negative and the attack on jazz musicians and the jazz culture cannot be denied. And of course, that was primarily, black and brown, in those times.
Yep. So I see we're coming up on 30 minutes here, and I definitely don't want to keep you, but I could talk forever. That's just my Brooklyn. I can talk forever. But so now that you wrote this book, you have this out there, what's the next step? I know you've got a great website, careerscannabis.com. You want to talk about your website? Let everybody know what you do.
Yeah, so I run a company called careerscannabis.com. We're a job search engine for cannabis jobs in Canada and United States. So if you're looking for a cannabis job in the legal company, then we're a great site for you to come visit. We're going to be building out more features, the ability to log on, create an account, and do a ton of really cool features. My background comes from recruitment. So I've done recruiting for 15 years. So I'm trying to do or add value to the cannabis industry by creating a platform to really help people get access. We wrote the book based on talking to a lot of folks about why they'd want to come to the industry, why they wouldn't. And stigma was a big issue. Family stigma. How do you talk to your kids? How do you talk to your parents? How do you talk to your grandparents? And so we wrote this book to essentially help folks, one, get a better understanding of the cannabis industry. There's a glossary in the back. And then on the other end, help you if you need to have that conversation at home and you're faced with that negative stigma and people think that you're just, all you're trying to do is, become a drug dealer or just work in a dispensary. And so we're really much driven around that mission. So our mission is to help end stigma and then to help improve that process of finding a job and a career in the cannabis industry.
I love it. I'm a fan of yours on LinkedIn. I'm glad we hooked up. I love this. Now you said that you would be kind enough to autograph a copy for one of our fans, and what I'm going to do is I'll auction it off, and I will be happy to donate 100% of the whatever we get for auction to a charity of your choice.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yes, absolutely. We'll put a book up to auction. I'll have it autographed. I haven't autographed a lot. But the other thing I want to just quickly say in terms of what's next. So this is the first book in book series. So in the book, we won't talk too much about the characters. The book is about 3 kids, Jack, Charlotte, and Bruce, whose parents work in the cannabis industry. Because of stigma, they don't tell anybody at school what their parents do until today. And so the book is really about how the kids explain how their parents met and what their parents actually do in the cannabis industry. And so throughout the book, as you understand how they met and became the Kids of Cannabis, you get an education on the Kids of Cannabis. What we're doing in terms of our series is we're going to do spin-off books about each character. So we have 2 books planned. One's about Charlotte, and Charlotte was up in a farm, 3rd-generation farmer, and so it's about her, her evolution of being a daughter of a farmer and getting into the cannabis industry, if you would, her family. And then the next book's about Bruce, and Bruce has a medical condition and uses cannabis medicinally, and then we really dive into that story, and all of this will kind of lead to why. And this is the story of cannabis. Because when you ask people why cannabis, they all have a personal reason that drove into it. And so the backstories on the 3 kids is that backstory, that what led their families to wanting to be in the cannabis industry. And so Charlotte, it's her family's a family farmer, and there's a backstory there. And Bruce is, he had to use cannabis because of his medical condition, so the family was exposed to cannabis because of that.
I love it. I love it. I hope you send me the new books, man.
When it's ready, send your copy.
That sounds cool, man. Because when my kid finished reading it, he goes, like, is that it? I was like, yeah, I guess so. I guess that's it.
But just it was just
that there was like a need. Like I want to find out more. Like continue it.
Yeah, and then so your son's gonna love the next two books. So then because the first book is just a primer. We wanted to educate people and easy, but the next book, there's a lot more adventure, a lot more.
But do you understand what you did for yourself there? Now you have an opportunity to go back and write the prequels on how their families grew up and and write the stories and make them more adult before the kids came into the picture.
Yeah, and so that's what we're working on. So we're doing the prequels and the three characters, and then once we've done those the next three books,
I love it.
We'll be doing the books of them modern day and what they now do as the kids of cannabis.
I love it. I really do. I really do, man. It's good. Oh man, thank you, Brian. Thank you. Anything you want to say to the Fanny? Any promotions you want to talk about? Anything you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love anybody who, if you think this book could help anybody in your family, if this can help your community, if you live in a state.
100% thumbs up, guys. 100% thumbs up.
Concern, I'd love for you to just share it, like it. It's available on Amazon. I think you can share the link after. So, again, and if you do happen to purchase the book, love to keep a comment or link with me on social, and love to get to know as many people as I can.
Awesome. Guys, I'm going to set up a link to do an auction for the book. So you guys, we're going to draw one random winner. It'll be personally autographed by Brian, and we'll donate the money to charity of his choice. And
Last Prisoner Project. So we'll just
awesome.
We'll just put that out there right there.
I've helped too. So that's good right there. Sounds good. Awesome. Brian, I'll be in touch soon.
I appreciate it.
I'll get this all done, do some editing, and I'll get it back to you.
Perfect. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you, Brian. Take care, everybody.
Take care.